In the sprawling Barrett estate of Marin County, a 78-year-old retired psychology professor was about to uncover a family conspiracy that would shatter everything she believed about trust. What started as a simple homecoming for her mother's funeral took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her own family's betrayal. Olivia Barrett wasn't your typical grieving daughter. For decades, she had spent her life studying human behavior and psychological manipulation, known for her ability to read people's hidden motivations. When she encountered sedatives in her evening tea during a family bonding ceremony, she had no idea her loved ones were plotting to steal her inheritance. But her lifetime of expertise would lead to a devastating reversal that exposed generations of family dysfunction and transformed them all forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wrought iron gates of the Barrett estate creaked open with a sound that echoed through Olivia's chest like a funeral bell. As her rental car crunched up the familiar gravel driveway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the 3 days since Grandmother Rose's funeral. The sprawling Victorian mansion, with its weathered shingles and wraparound porch, looked exactly the same, yet it felt alien, as if she were viewing it through a stranger's eyes. Olivia parked beside her son's BMW and sat for a moment, her hands still gripping the steering wheel. The weight of her psychology journals in the back seat reminded her of the decades she'd spent analyzing human behavior from both academic and practical perspectives. At 76, she'd grown accustomed to reading people's motivations with the wisdom that came from a lifetime of observation. But grief had a way of clouding even the most experienced observer's judgment. The front door opened before she could knock, and her daughter-in-law Linda appeared, arms outstretched in an embrace that felt slightly too tight, too long. "Olivia, I'm so glad you're staying for a few more days. The house feels so empty without Rose's presence." Linda's smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and Olivia noticed the way her daughter-in-law's hands trembled slightly as she guided her inside. The familiar scent of lavender and old wood should have been comforting, but instead it carried an undercurrent of tension that made Olivia's shoulders tighten. "Where's David?" Olivia asked, setting her overnight bag by the mahogany staircase that had been polished to an almost mirror-like shine. "In the study with Richard. They're handling some of the paperwork." Linda's voice carried an odd note, and she quickly busied herself with Olivia's coat, hanging it with unnecessary precision in the hall closet. The study door was partially open, and Olivia could hear her son David's voice, strained and urgent. "Can't wait much longer. The pressure is—" The conversation stopped abruptly as her footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. "Mom!" David emerged from the study, his arms wide and his smile brilliant, but Olivia caught the split second of alarm that had flashed across his face. Her son had always been handsome in that distinguished way that came with success. Salt and pepper hair, strong jawline, expensive suits that fit perfectly. Today, however, she noticed the slight puffiness under his eyes, the way his shirt collar seemed looser than it should be. Brother Richard followed, his tall frame filling the doorway. Where David projected warmth, Richard radiated a cold professionalism that had always made Olivia slightly uncomfortable. His law practice had been successful once, she knew, though she'd heard whispers of recent struggles. "Olivia, my condolences again on Rose's passing," Richard said, his handshake firm but brief. She was quite the woman, quite particular about her wishes. Something in his tone made Olivia study his face more carefully. In her decades of work in psychology, she'd learned to read micro-expressions, those fleeting moments when a person's true feelings leaked through their composed facade. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when he mentioned their mother's wishes. "About the will reading," David interjected, running a hand through his hair, a nervous habit Olivia remembered from childhood. "I'm afraid there's been a delay. Some legal complications that Richard needs to sort through first." "What kind of complications?" Olivia asked, her psychological training kicking in despite her emotional exhaustion. "Nothing serious," Richard said quickly. "Just some paperwork issues." Crossed T's and dotted I's, you know how it is with estates this size. Rose was thorough. Perhaps too thorough in some respects. The way he said too thorough carried a weight that didn't match his casual tone. Olivia filed the observation away, feeling the familiar academic curiosity stirring beneath her grief. "Well," Linda announced with forced brightness, "I think we should have a proper family dinner tonight. It's been too long since we've all been together under one roof." The dinner was an exercise in careful conversation, everyone dancing around the elephant in the room, Rose's will and what it might contain. Olivia found herself studying her family members with new eyes, noticing the way her mother kept refilling everyone's wine glasses, how her father's laugh seemed just a beat too loud, how Richard barely touched his food. As they moved to the living room for coffee, Richard cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said, settling into Rose's favorite armchair with a proprietary air that made Olivia wince. "With all the stress and grief we're processing, perhaps we should institute some family traditions. Something to help us reconnect during this difficult time." "What did you have in mind?" David asked, though something in his posture suggested this wasn't the first time they'd discussed it. "Tea ceremonies," Richard announced. Rose always believed in the therapeutic power of shared rituals. "I think she would have wanted us to come together regularly, to talk and heal as a family." Olivia blinked in surprise. "Grandmother never mentioned tea ceremonies to me. She was more of a coffee person, actually." A brief silence fell over the room. Linda's teacup rattled against its saucer. "Well," Richard continued smoothly, "people change. Perhaps she mentioned it to David and me in her final months. The important thing is bringing the family together." Something about the suggestion felt off, artificial in a way that made Olivia's academic instincts prickle. Her grandmother had been many things: shrewd, protective, occasionally sharp-tongued. But she'd never been one for manufactured traditions or therapeutic rituals. "I think it's a lovely idea," Linda said quickly, her voice pitched higher than usual. "Very healing." David nodded with what seemed like relief. "Yes, exactly what we need. Tomorrow evening, perhaps? After Olivia has had time to settle in properly." As if on cue, Linda disappeared into the kitchen and returned with an ornate tea service that Olivia didn't recognize. The delicate porcelain cups were painted with small roses, and Linda handled them with unusual care, as if they might break at the slightest touch. "Where did this come from?" Olivia asked, accepting a cup of what Linda announced was chamomile tea. "Rose left it specifically for family gatherings," Richard said, along with some special tea blends she'd been collecting. The tea was pleasant enough, with a slightly herbal aftertaste, but as Olivia sipped it, she began to feel an odd drowsiness settling over her. The stress of the funeral, the emotional weight of being back in this house, the wine at dinner, it all made sense that she'd be tired. Yet something about the heaviness in her limbs felt different, more complete than ordinary fatigue. "You look exhausted, sweetheart," Linda observed, hovering near Olivia's chair. "Perhaps you should get some rest." Olivia nodded, surprised by how difficult it was becoming to keep her eyes open. "Yes, I think that's a good idea." As she stood, the room seemed to tilt slightly, and David was immediately at her side, his hand firm on her elbow. "Careful there. Grief hits us all differently." "I'm fine," Olivia mumbled, though she wasn't entirely sure she was. "Just tired." Richard had moved to the coffee table, where several official-looking documents lay scattered. "Oh, while you're here, Olivia, perhaps you could glance at these. Nothing urgent, just some estate-related paperwork that will need attention eventually." Even through her growing fog, Olivia noticed the curious timing. She picked up the top document, trying to focus on the legal language that seemed to swim before her eyes. Something about beneficiary changes and asset transfers, but the words wouldn't quite make sense. "Tomorrow," she said, setting the papers down with care. "I can't. My eyes are too tired to read legal documents tonight." "Of course," Richard said, but she caught the look that passed between him and David, a look of frustration quickly masked. As Olivia made her way upstairs to her childhood bedroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened, though she couldn't quite grasp what. The tea ceremony, the timing of the documents, The way everyone seemed to be watching her so carefully, it all felt orchestrated in a way that her training told her to examine more closely. But the exhaustion was overwhelming now, pulling her down like a tide. She barely managed to change into her pajamas before collapsing into bed, her mind struggling to hold on to the observations she'd made. As consciousness faded, one thought managed to surface through the drowsiness. Since when did Uncle Richard care about family healing? And why did those legal documents appear just as she was at her most vulnerable? The questions followed her into a deep, dreamless sleep, but they would be waiting for her in the morning, sharper and more insistent than before. Olivia woke with a clarity that surprised her. The previous night's drowsiness had lifted completely, replaced by a mental sharpness that made her question everything about the evening before. Sunlight streamed through her childhood bedroom windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny question marks in the air. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, where Linda was already bustling around the kitchen with nervous energy. Her mother looked like she hadn't slept well. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a hasty ponytail. "Good morning, sweetheart," Linda said, her voice overly bright. "I've made your favorite blueberry pancakes. You always loved them as a child." The gesture felt forced, another piece of performance in what Olivia was beginning to recognize as a carefully orchestrated family reunion. She accepted the plate but found her appetite had vanished. "Where are Dad and Uncle Richard?" Olivia asked, noting the absence of voices from the study. "Richard left early for the office. Some urgent client matter." Linda's hands fluttered as she spoke, rearranging items on the counter that didn't need rearranging. "Your father went into town to handle some errands." The timing felt convenient, almost too convenient. Olivia was about to probe further when the front doorbell chimed. Linda tensed visibly, her coffee mug rattling against the counter. "I'll get it," Olivia offered, but Linda was already moving. No, I'll handle it. You finish your breakfast." Through the kitchen doorway, Olivia could see Linda open the front door to reveal Dr. Sarah Martinez, the family's longtime pharmacist. Sarah had been Olivia's mentor during her undergraduate studies, helping her navigate the pre-med track before she'd switched to psychology. The older woman's presence was both unexpected and comforting. "Sarah," Linda's voice carried a note of strain. "What a surprise." "I hope I'm not intruding," Sarah said, her warm voice carrying clearly to the kitchen. "I wanted to check on Olivia after the funeral. Rose's passing was such a shock to all of us." Olivia emerged from the kitchen, genuinely pleased to see the woman who had been like a second mother to her during college. Sarah's embrace was warm and real, lacking the artificial quality that had characterized her family's interactions. "Dr. Martinez, Sarah, I'm so glad you're here," Olivia said, meaning it completely. Sarah studied her face with the keen attention Olivia remembered from their mentoring sessions. "You look well, Misha. Better than I expected, given the circumstances." Her dark eyes seemed to be searching for something specific. "Would you like some coffee?" Linda interjected quickly. "Or perhaps some tea? We've been exploring some new blends lately." Something flickered across Sarah's expression at the mention of tea, too quick for Linda to catch but not quick enough to escape Olivia's trained observation. "Coffee would be lovely," Sarah said. "Linda, would you mind if I spoke with Olivia privately? I have some academic matters I wanted to discuss with her." Linda's reluctance was palpable. "Of course, I need to check on the laundry anyway." Once they were alone in the living room, Sarah's demeanor shifted. The warmth remained, but it was now underlaid with something more serious. "Olivia, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." Sarah's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Have you been experiencing any unusual symptoms lately? Drowsiness, confusion, memory gaps?" The directness of the question caught Olivia off guard. "Why would you ask that?" Sarah glanced toward the kitchen, then leaned closer. "Because I've been concerned about some prescriptions I've filled recently for your family. Sedatives, specifically, quantities that seem excessive for normal grief counseling." Olivia's academic training kicked in, analyzing the implications. "What kind of sedatives?" "Lorazepam, primarily. Stronger than what's typically prescribed for anxiety." And the quantities? Sarah shook her head. Your Uncle Richard picked them up, claimed they were for the whole family's stress management. The pieces began clicking into place with disturbing clarity. The unexpected drowsiness, the convenient timing of legal documents, the way her family had watched her so carefully during the tea ceremony. Sarah, Olivia said slowly, what would happen if someone put lorazepam in tea? The older woman's face grew grave. It would be nearly tasteless, especially in something herbal like chamomile. The person would become drowsy, compliant, possibly confused. Their judgment would be severely impaired. Olivia felt the blood drain from her face. And if someone were to sign legal documents while under that influence, they wouldn't be considered legally competent to make such decisions. Any contracts signed in that state could be challenged. Sarah's hand found Olivia's arm. Mija, are you telling me you think someone drugged you? Before Olivia could answer, Linda's footsteps echoed from the hallway. Sarah immediately straightened, her expression shifting back to casual concern. So I told her the research position was still available if she's interested, Sarah said loudly enough for Linda to hear as she entered the room. That sounds wonderful, Linda said, but her eyes were sharp, searching both their faces for signs of what they'd been discussing. Sarah, I hate to rush you, but Olivia has another tea ceremony this evening. Family tradition, you understand. She'll need to rest beforehand. Of course, Sarah said, standing. She squeezed Olivia's hand as she rose, and Olivia felt something small and hard pressed into her palm. Take care of yourself, Mia. And remember, you're stronger and smarter than people give you credit for. After Sarah left, Linda hovered anxiously around Olivia. What did Dr. Martinez want to discuss? About your studies, I mean. Just some research opportunities, Olivia said, palming whatever Sarah had given her. Nothing urgent. Good, good. You know, I was thinking we should do the tea ceremony earlier tonight. Maybe around 6? Richard has some important documents he'd like you to review, and your father thinks it would be better to handle these things while we're all relaxed. The casualness of the suggestion didn't mask its implications. Olivia nodded, playing along while her mind raced. That sounds fine, Mom. When Linda disappeared back into the kitchen, Olivia opened her palm to find a small piece of paper folded tightly. Sarah's handwriting was cramped but clear. Call me from your cell. They can't monitor that. Trust your instincts. You're in danger. Olivia stared at the note, her psychological training warring with her emotional attachment to her family. Everything she'd observed, the delayed will reading, the forced tea ceremonies, the convenient timing of legal documents, her mother's nervous behavior, suddenly formed a coherent pattern. Her own family was drugging her. The realization hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her legs unsteady. She sank into Rose's favorite armchair, the same one Uncle Richard had claimed so proprietarily the night before, and tried to process the magnitude of what Sarah had suggested. But even as shock overwhelmed her, another part of her mind, the part trained in human behavior and psychological manipulation, was already beginning to plan. If her family thought they could drug her into compliance, they had underestimated both her intelligence and her determination. Tonight's tea ceremony would proceed as planned, but this time Olivia would be ready for them. She folded Sarah's note carefully and tucked it into her pocket, her grief for her grandmother now complicated by a growing anger that burned cold and clear. Rose had always told her that knowledge was power, and Olivia was about to discover just how much power she actually possessed. Olivia spent the afternoon in careful observation, moving through the house with new eyes while maintaining the facade of a grieving granddaughter. Every interaction felt loaded with hidden meaning, every glance between her parents carrying weight she was only beginning to understand. She called Sarah from her cell phone during a walk in the garden, confirming her worst fears about the sedatives, and learning that the quantities ordered could keep someone compliant for hours. As evening approached, the family began gathering in the living room for what Linda kept calling their healing ceremony. Olivia positioned herself strategically, noting escape routes and watching her family's body language with the clinical detachment her training had taught her. Uncle Richard arrived precisely at 6, carrying his leather briefcase with an air of professional importance. David emerged from the study looking haggard, his usual charm dimmed by whatever stress he was carrying. Linda fussed with the ornate tea service, her movements jerky with nervous energy. "Where's Jenny?" Olivia asked, noticing her cousin's absence. "She'll be along," Richard said dismissively. "Some young people don't appreciate the importance of family traditions." The words had barely left his mouth when the front door opened and Jenny Barrett strode in, her combat boots loud on the hardwood floor. At 25, Jenny carried herself with the confident swagger of someone who had learned early that life rarely offered second chances. Her dark hair was streaked with purple, and her leather jacket spoke of a rebellious streak that had always put her at odds with her father's conservative sensibilities. "Sorry I'm late," Jenny announced, though she didn't sound particularly sorry. Traffic was murder. Richard's jaw tightened. "We were just about to begin the ceremony." "Ceremony," Jenny repeated, her tone making it clear what she thought of the term. Her eyes found Olivia's across the room, and something passed between them, a look that held more weight than casual acknowledgement. As Linda began preparing the tea with her now familiar, nervous precision, Jenny drifted closer to Olivia. "Nice evening for family bonding," she said casually, but her voice carried an undercurrent that made Olivia look at her more sharply. "Jenny, would you help me in the kitchen?" Linda called, her voice pitched higher than usual. "Actually, Mom, I think Jenny should stay with us," David interjected quickly. "Family unity and all that." The exchange felt choreographed, and Olivia noticed how Jenny's expression darkened at her father's words. Something was happening beneath the surface of this family gathering. Currents of tension that went deeper than grief or inheritance disputes. "Olivia," Jenny said suddenly, her voice carrying clearly across the room, "could you help me find something upstairs? I think I left my phone charger in the guest room last time I was here." Before anyone could object, Jenny was already moving toward the stairs, and something in her posture told Olivia this wasn't really about a phone charger. She followed, aware of the sharp looks exchanged between the adults behind them. Jenny led her to the guest room and immediately closed the door, turning to face Olivia with an intensity that transformed her entire demeanor. Gone was the casual rebelliousness, replaced by something focused and urgent. "We need to talk, and we don't have much time," Jenny said, her voice low and serious. "How much do you know about what's really happening here?" The directness of the question caught Olivia off guard. "What do you mean?" Jenny studied her face for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "You felt it last night, didn't you? The drowsiness after the tea? The way the room seemed to tilt when you stood up?" Olivia's training told her to be cautious, but something in Jenny's expression suggested desperation rather than deception. "How do you know about that?" "Because I've been watching this family destroy itself for months," Jenny said, moving to the window and peering down at the driveway as if checking for something. "And I've been listening to conversations I wasn't supposed to hear." "What conversations?" Jenny turned back to her, and Olivia saw something she'd never noticed before. Fear. Not the rebellious bravado Jenny usually projected, but genuine bone-deep fear. "My father and your dad have been planning this for weeks. The tea ceremonies, the delayed will reading, the legal documents. Olivia, they're drugging you to get access to your inheritance." The words hit like a physical blow, even though Sarah's warning had already prepared her for this possibility. Hearing it confirmed by someone inside the conspiracy made it horrifyingly real. "You know about the drugs?" Olivia whispered. "Lorazepam in the tea. Makes you compliant, confused, perfect for signing away your rights." Jenny's hands clenched into fists. "My father drafted the documents. He's been bragging about how clean it all is, how no one will be able to prove coercion afterward." Olivia felt the room spin, not from drugs this time, but from the magnitude of the betrayal. "Why are you telling me this?" Jenny's laugh was bitter. "Because I may be a lot of things, but I'm not a thief. And because I know what it's like to be trapped by family expectations." She paused, her expression softening slightly. "Also, because my criminal justice background taught me to recognize a felony when I see one being planned. Your father is desperate and stupid, but he's still my father," Jenny said firmly. "Which is why we need to handle this carefully. If this blows up the wrong way, people go to prison, including people I care about, despite everything." Olivia's mind raced through the implications. What do you know about their financial situation? Everything. Jenny moved to the door, listening for footsteps. Your dad owes serious money to serious people. Uncle David's gambling problem finally caught up with him, and now there's a guy named Marcus Torres breathing down his neck. They see your inheritance as the only way out. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Her father's haggard appearance, her mother's nervous energy, Uncle Richard's cold professionalism. They weren't just grieving Rose's death, they were orchestrating Olivia's financial destruction. Tonight, Jenny continued, they're planning to have you sign transfer documents. Real ones, not the practice run from last night. The tea will be stronger this time, enough to make you barely conscious but still technically capable of signing. How do you know all this? Because they needed someone to witness the signatures, and family members make the best witnesses. They thought I'd go along with it if it meant protecting my father from his creditors. Jenny's expression hardened. They were wrong. Footsteps sounded in the hallway outside, and Jenny immediately grabbed a phone charger from the nightstand. Found it! She called out, opening the door to reveal Linda approaching with obvious concern. Is everything all right up here? Linda asked, her eyes darting between them. Just catching up, Jenny said easily, slipping back into her casual persona. Olivia was telling me about her graduate program. Sounds fascinating. As they walked back downstairs, Jenny leaned close to Olivia's ear. Don't drink the tea tonight, she whispered. And when they present the documents, play along but don't sign anything. I'll create a distraction if I have to. They returned to the living room where David and Richard waited with barely concealed impatience. The tea service was ready, steam rising from the delicate cups in the lamplight. Olivia looked at the innocent-seeming porcelain and felt her stomach turn. Ah, there you are, Richard said, his smile not reaching his eyes. Shall we begin? I have some rather urgent matters to discuss with Olivia tonight. As Linda began pouring tea with hands that trembled slightly, Olivia caught Jenny's eye across the room. Her cousin gave an almost imperceptible nod, a promise that whatever happened next, Olivia wouldn't face it alone. The game was about to begin in earnest, but for the first time since returning home, Olivia felt like she might actually have a chance to win. The tea ceremony proceeded with agonizing slowness, each minute feeling like an hour as Olivia pretended to sip from her cup while actually letting the liquid barely touch her lips. She watched her family through new eyes, noting the way David's hands shook slightly as he reached for his own cup, how Richard kept checking his watch, how Linda couldn't seem to sit still. You know, Olivia said carefully, setting down her barely touched tea. I've been thinking about grandmother's office. There might be some personal items up there I'd like to go through before we settle everything legally. The suggestion landed like a stone in still water. David and Richard exchanged a look that lasted a beat too long. I'm not sure that's necessary, Richard said smoothly. Rose was quite organized. I doubt there's anything up there that wasn't already catalogued for the estate. Still, Olivia pressed, it would give me some closure. Maybe tomorrow morning? Before we handle any more paperwork? Of course, sweetheart, David said, but his voice carried a strain that hadn't been there before. Though we really should focus on the legal matters first. Time-sensitive issues, you understand. Jenny cleared her throat. Actually, I think that's a great idea. I'd love to help you go through grandmother's things. We could do it tonight, after this ceremony. The suggestion clearly wasn't part of the plan. Linda's teacup rattled against its saucer, and Richard's jaw tightened visibly. Tonight seems rushed, Richard said. Perhaps we should... No, I think Jenny's right, Olivia said, standing with deliberate unsteadiness to mimic the effects she should be feeling from the drugged tea. I'm feeling much more relaxed now. This tea really is wonderful, Mom. Maybe after we handle Uncle Richard's documents, Jenny and I could start going through some of Grandmother's personal effects. She swayed slightly, and David was immediately at her side, his relief at her apparent compliance evident in the way his shoulders relaxed. Careful there, he said, guiding her back to her chair. Why don't we take care of the paperwork first, and then you can rest properly? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Richard was already opening his briefcase, pulling out a folder thick with official-looking documents. These are just formalities, really. Estate management. Beneficiary updates. Nothing too complex, but they do need your signature tonight. As he spread the papers across the coffee table, Olivia leaned forward with exaggerated effort, pretending to focus through a fog that wasn't there. What she saw made her blood run cold. These weren't simple estate documents. They were comprehensive transfers of assets, power of attorney assignments, and what looked like loan agreements using her inheritance as collateral. "This seems like a lot of paperwork for formalities," she said, her voice deliberately slurred. "Legal requirements," Richard explained, his tone patient but urgent. "The more we can resolve tonight, the less complicated things will be later." Jenny moved closer, ostensibly to help support Olivia but actually positioning herself to see the documents. "Wow, Uncle Richard, this is really thorough. You must have worked on these for weeks." "Preparation is everything," Richard replied, missing the sharpness in Jenny's tone. "I think I need some fresh air," Olivia announced suddenly, standing with Jenny's help. "Just for a minute. The room feels warm." "I'll help her," Jenny said quickly. "Get some air on the porch." Before the adults could object, the cousins were outside on the wraparound porch, the cool evening air, a sharp contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. "Did you see those documents?" Olivia whispered, her pretense dropping immediately. "Enough to know we need evidence," Jenny replied, pulling out her phone. "I'm going to text myself the details I remember, but we need photos or copies. How do we get back in there without them getting suspicious?" Jenny was quiet for a moment, thinking. "We tell them you're feeling sick from the tea, which you should be if you'd actually drunk it. I'll suggest we postpone the signing until tomorrow, when you're feeling better. That buys us time." "They won't like that." "No, but they can't force you to sign if you're too sick to hold a pen. Even they aren't that obvious about it." They returned to find the family clustered around the coffee table, speaking in hushed tones that stopped abruptly when the door opened. "I'm sorry," Olivia said, letting Jenny support her weight. "I think the tea was too strong. I'm feeling quite nauseous." The disappointment on her father's face was quickly masked by concern. "Oh, sweetheart, perhaps we should postpone this until tomorrow, when you're feeling better." "But the timing," Richard began. "Can wait 12 hours? Jenny interrupted firmly. "Unless these documents have some kind of expiration date?" Richard's pause was a moment too long. "Of course not. Olivia's health is the priority." As they helped Olivia upstairs to her room, she caught Linda wiping tears from her eyes. For a moment, she felt a stab of sympathy for her mother, but then she remembered the tea service, and the sympathy hardened into resolve. Once alone in her room with Jenny, they began planning in earnest. "We need to get into your dad's study," Olivia said. "If this conspiracy is as elaborate as it seems, there will be more evidence there." "He keeps it locked when he's not there, but I know where he hides the spare key," Jenny said. "The question is when." "They'll be watching you closely now." "What about early morning, before anyone else is awake?" Jenny nodded. 4 a.m. The house will be quiet, and we can search without interruption." "What exactly are we looking for?" "Financial records, communication with this Marcus Torres character, maybe drafts of the documents that show premeditation." Jenny's expression was grim. "And anything that shows how deep this goes. Is it just my father and Uncle David, or are there others involved?" They spent the next hour going over every detail Jenny could remember about conversations she'd overheard, creating a timeline of the conspiracy's development. The picture that emerged was of desperate people making increasingly dangerous choices. "Jenny," Olivia said finally, "why are you helping me? Really?" Her cousin was quiet for a long moment. "Because I've watched my father make terrible decisions my entire life, and I've seen how financial pressure can make people do things they never thought they were capable of. But this," she gestured toward the door, "this crosses every line." Even if it means your father might go to prison, maybe that's what it'll take for him to get help. Jenny's voice was steady, but Olivia could see the pain in her eyes. I can't save him from himself, but I can try to stop him from destroying everyone else in the process. As Jenny prepared to leave for the night, maintaining the illusion that nothing had changed, Olivia felt the weight of what they were planning. In a few hours, they would be gathering evidence against their own family members, evidence that could destroy lives, even as it saved her inheritance. But as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around her, one thought kept returning. How many other family secrets were buried in David's study? And what else might they uncover when they opened that door? The clock on her nightstand showed 11:47 p.m. In 4 hours and 13 minutes, she would find out. Olivia's phone buzzed at exactly 3:55 a.m., Jenny's text reading simply, "Coast clear. Meet me downstairs." She slipped from her bed, already dressed in dark clothes, and made her way through the familiar hallways of her childhood home with the stealth of someone who knew every creaking floorboard. Jenny waited by the study door, a small flashlight in her hand and tension radiating from every line of her body. "The key was where I thought," she whispered, holding up a small brass key. "But we need to be fast. Dad's always been a light sleeper." The study door opened with the softest click, and they slipped inside, closing it behind them. Jenny's flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing David's orderly desk, filing cabinets, and a wall safe that was slightly ajar. "He's been careless," Jenny murmured, pointing to the safe. "Stress makes people sloppy." They began their search methodically, Jenny photographing documents while Olivia sorted through files. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. Financial records showed David's gambling debts totaling over $2 million, with interest rates that spoke of desperate borrowing from increasingly dangerous sources. "Look at this," Olivia whispered, holding up a folder labeled Barrett Estate Solutions. Inside were multiple drafts of the legal documents they'd seen the night before, showing weeks of careful planning. But more disturbing were the communications with Marcus Torres, detailing not just loans but threats that grew progressively more explicit. "Final deadline March 15th, Jenny read from one email. "After that, collateral collection becomes necessary." "That's in 3 days, Olivia." The timeline suddenly made horrifying sense. The tea ceremonies hadn't been about family healing. They'd been practice runs for the final deception. Tonight's interrupted ceremony was meant to be the culmination, with Olivia signing away her inheritance mere days before Torres took more violent collection measures. "There's more," Olivia said, pulling another file from the safe. "Look at this. Correspondence with a private medical facility. They were planning to have me committed if the signing didn't work." The documents laid out a backup plan that was chillingly thorough. If Olivia couldn't be drugged into compliance, she would be declared mentally incompetent due to grief-induced breakdown, with David gaining conservatorship over her affairs. "Your own father," Jenny said, her voice barely audible. "Our own family," Olivia corrected, noting Richard's signature on several of the backup plans. They photographed everything, their phones' camera flashes seeming dangerously bright in the dark room. As they worked, Olivia found herself thinking about her grandmother Rose, wondering if she had suspected David's desperation. The woman who had built the Barrett fortune from nothing would have recognized the signs of financial self-destruction. "We need to get out of here," Jenny said, checking her watch. "It's almost 5. Dad will be up soon." But as they prepared to leave, Olivia spotted something that made her heart race. On David's desk calendar, today's date was circled in red ink with a notation: "Final ceremony, 6 p.m. MT, arrival 8 p.m. "Marcus Torres is coming tonight," she whispered. "Whatever they're planning, it has to happen today." They slipped from the study and back to Olivia's room, where they spent the remaining hours before dawn planning their response. The evidence they'd gathered was damning, but it also revealed the full scope of the danger they faced. "We can't just go to the police," Jenny pointed out. "Torres isn't going to wait for legal proceedings. If this falls apart messily, people could get hurt. So what do we do? Jenny was quiet for a long moment. We give them what they want, but on our terms. You sign the documents tonight, but in a way that protects you and gives us evidence of coercion. How? By making sure the tea they give you goes to someone else instead. The plan they devised was risky, but elegant. Olivia would attend the evening ceremony as expected, but this time she would switch her drug tea with someone else's cup. With the conspirators affected by their own sedatives, they would be vulnerable to questioning and confession, while Olivia remained alert to document everything. The question is whose cup to switch with, Olivia said. My father's, Jenny replied without hesitation. He's the one with the legal expertise. If anyone's going to confess to the full scope of this, it should be him. As morning broke, they heard movement downstairs. David and Linda beginning their daily routines, unaware that their conspiracy had been exposed. Olivia felt the weight of performance settling over her again, but this time she would be the one controlling the script. Remember, Jenny said as they prepared to join the family for breakfast, act like you're feeling better, but still slightly off. Make them think the tea is working but needs one more strong dose to finish the job. And if something goes wrong tonight, then we improvise. But Olivia, whatever happens, don't let them make you sign anything until after the cup switch. Once they're affected by the sedatives, they can't claim the signatures were obtained legally. Breakfast was an exercise in careful performance. Olivia complained of lingering grogginess, while David watched her with barely concealed anxiety. Linda hovered more than usual, and Uncle Richard arrived early with his briefcase and an air of grim determination. Feeling better this morning? Richard asked, studying Olivia's face. Much better, she replied, adding just enough hesitation to suggest she wasn't completely recovered. I think tonight's ceremony will be perfect. I'm ready to put all this legal business behind us. The relief that crossed her father's face was both satisfying and heartbreaking. David Barrett might be a desperate man driven to terrible choices, but he was still her father. And tonight she would have to watch him destroy himself with his own methods. Excellent, Richard said. I've prepared everything for this evening. After tonight, all the stress and uncertainty will be over. He was right about that, Olivia thought. After tonight, everything would be different. The only question was whether her family would survive the truth she was about to force them to confront. As the day progressed toward evening, Olivia found herself thinking about Rose's favorite saying, "The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you try to bury it." Tonight she would honor her grandmother's memory by bringing every buried truth to light. The final tea ceremony was only hours away. The formal dining room had been transformed into what Richard clearly believed would be the final act of their conspiracy. The ornate tea service sat prominently on the mahogany table, surrounded by neat stacks of legal documents. Candles flickered in the chandelier above, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mirror the deception playing out below. Olivia entered the room at exactly 6 o'clock, portraying the perfect picture of a grieving granddaughter ready to trust her family's guidance. David stood by the window, his usually confident posture undermined by the tension in his shoulders. Linda hovered near the tea service, her hands trembling as she arranged the delicate cups with their painted roses. "You look much better tonight, sweetheart," David said, his relief genuine despite the circumstances. "Ready to put all this uncertainty behind us?" "I think so," Olivia replied, settling into her chair with deliberate care. "The stress has been overwhelming. I'm grateful to have family to guide me through this." Richard entered with his briefcase, his movements sharp and efficient. "Excellent. I've organized everything for maximum clarity. We'll handle the legal matters first, then celebrate with a proper family toast." Jenny arrived last, slipping into the room with her usual studied nonchalance. But Olivia caught the slight nod her cousin gave her. Everything was in place. "Before we begin," Olivia said, "I want to thank you all for being so patient with me. Grandmother Rose always said family was everything, and I finally understand what she meant." The words hit their targets with precision. David's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. while Linda's guilt manifested in the way she couldn't quite meet Olivia's gaze. Even Richard softened slightly, perhaps remembering that beneath the legal documents sat a young woman mourning her grandmother. "Rose would be proud of how we're handling this," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "She always wanted the family to stay together." Linda began pouring tea with ritualistic precision, each cup filled to exactly the same level. Olivia watched carefully as her mother's hand shook, noting which cup was hers, the one Linda had prepared with extra care, adding what Olivia now knew was a carefully measured dose of lorazepam. "The chamomile is particularly soothing tonight," Linda announced, her voice artificially bright. "I added some special herbs that should help with relaxation." "Perfect," Olivia said, accepting her cup while tracking the placement of each family member's tea. Richard sat directly across from her, his cup within easy reach if she could create the right distraction. "Now then," Richard began, opening his briefcase and spreading documents across the table. "These are the final estate management papers. Much simpler than they look, really. Just signature lines where indicated." As he explained each document with legal precision, Olivia realized how thoroughly they had planned this moment. The papers would transfer not just her inheritance but her entire financial future into David's control, ostensibly for, quote, estate management purposes, but actually to satisfy his crushing debts. "This seems very comprehensive," she said, lifting her teacup as if to drink but barely wetting her lips. "You've thought of everything." "Preparation is key," Richard replied, his professional pride overriding his caution. "I've been working on these for weeks, ensuring every contingency is covered." Jenny cleared her throat. "Dad, you've really outdone yourself. This must have taken incredible planning." "Well," Richard said, warming to the praise, "complex situations require sophisticated solutions. Your Uncle David's financial challenges demanded creative approaches." The admission hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. David shot his brother a sharp look, but the damage was done. "I feel dizzy," Olivia announced suddenly, standing unsteadily while secretly palming her full teacup. "Could someone help me to the bathroom? I think I need a moment." In the confusion that followed, David rushing to support her, Linda fussing with concern, Richard organizing his papers to prevent them from being disturbed, Olivia managed to switch her cup with Richard's. The maneuver was swift and practiced, a sleight of hand she'd rehearsed mentally dozens of times. "I'm fine," she said, settling back into her chair and reaching for what was now Richard's original cup. "Just a moment of dizziness. The tea is helping already." She took a deliberately large sip of the unspiked tea, while Richard, distracted by his documents, absently reached for what had been her cup. Within minutes, the lorazepam began taking effect on its unintended target. "Now then," Richard said, his words beginning to slur slightly, "let's proceed with the signatures. Time is rather important tonight." "Uncle Richard, are you feeling all right?" Jenny asked with perfectly feigned concern. "You seem tired." "Fine, fine," he mumbled, but his movements were becoming sluggish, his professional demeanor giving way to something more vulnerable. "Marcus will be here soon. Need to finish before." He caught himself, but not before David had gone pale. "Who's Marcus?" Olivia asked innocently, though her heart was racing. "Nobody," David said quickly, but Richard was beyond caring about discretion. "Marcus Torres," Richard said, his inhibitions dissolved by the sedative. "The gentleman financing our solution to David's predicament." The confession spilled out of him like water from a broken dam. Years of resentment toward Rose's favoritism, his own failing law practice, the increasing desperation that had driven him to draft fraudulent documents. David tried to stop him, but Richard was beyond restraint. $2 million, Richard continued, his words growing heavier. "That's what David owes. Gambling debts, bad investments. Torres gave us until tonight to provide collateral." "Richard, stop," David pleaded, but his brother was lost in the fog of forced honesty. "The tea," Richard mumbled, looking confused at his cup. Linda puts medicine in the tea, makes people compliant. Olivia was supposed to. Olivia's eyes lingered on those last titles, her heart clenching as she realized her grandmother had been educating herself about David's struggles long before tonight's dramatic revelation. Rose had been preparing to help her son even as he spiraled deeper into the lies and desperation that had led to this moment. Behind the desk hung a landscape painting that had fascinated Olivia as a child. A serene mountain scene that seemed to change subtly depending on the light and the viewer's angle. Rose had commissioned it specifically for this room, claiming it helped her think. What Olivia had discovered years ago, during one of her teenage explorations of the house, was that the painting concealed a small wall safe. Her fingers trembled slightly as she approached the hidden mechanism, muscle memory guiding her through the process Rose had taught her during a summer visit when Olivia was 16. "Promise me you'll remember this combination," Rose had said, her voice carrying an unusual gravity. "Just in case something happens to me and the family needs guidance." The numbers came back to her as clearly as if Rose had spoken them yesterday. October 15th, 97, her own birthday. It had seemed like a simple gesture of favoritism then, a grandmother's way of making her granddaughter feel special. Now, Olivia understood it had been something far more significant, a key to knowledge that Rose had always intended for her to inherit. The safe opened with a soft, mechanical whisper, revealing neat stacks of documents bound with silk ribbons and a wooden jewelry box she'd never seen before. The box was crafted from cherry wood, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling, and when she lifted the lid, she found it contained not jewelry but letters, dozens of them, each one addressed in Rose's careful, flowing handwriting. The first letter bore her own name in elegant script, and the date made her breath catch. Just 3 months before Rose's death, when the family had believed her grandmother was in perfect health and planning for many more years of life. With shaking hands, Olivia unfolded the cream-colored stationery that bore Rose's personal monogram. "My dearest granddaughter, if you're reading this, then my suspicions about your father's financial troubles have proven correct, and you've discovered the lengths to which desperate people will go when they believe they have no other choices. I've been watching David's decline for months now, seeing the signs of gambling addiction that he believes he's hidden so cleverly from the family. You might wonder why I didn't confront him directly, why I allowed this crisis to develop instead of intervening earlier. The answer is both simple and heartbreaking, because addiction is a disease that can only be cured when the sufferer chooses recovery, and that choice often comes only in the face of consequences too severe to ignore." Olivia's hands shook as she continued reading, her grandmother's voice seeming to speak directly from the pages. Rose had known everything about the mounting debts that started with legitimate business losses but spiraled into desperate gambling, about Richard's failing law practice and his increasing willingness to bend ethical rules for financial gain, even about the growing pressure from creditors who operated outside the boundaries of conventional banking. "I've spent the last 6 months investigating the full scope of the situation," the letter continued. "David owes approximately $2 million to various creditors, with Marcus Torres representing the most dangerous of these relationships. Torres operates what he calls a, quote, private lending service, but what we would more accurately describe as loan sharking with a veneer of legal respectability. Your Uncle Richard, in his desperation to save his own failing practice, has become complicit in increasingly questionable schemes. The plan to drug you into signing fraudulent documents was not their first attempt at solving this crisis through deception, merely their most desperate." The clinical precision of Rose's analysis was both comforting and devastating. Her grandmother had approached this family crisis with the same methodical intelligence she'd applied to building her business empire, but the pain beneath the facts was evident in the slight tremor of her handwriting on certain words. "I've structured my will very carefully, not just to protect you but to provide a path for the family's redemption if they're willing to take it. The inheritance you've received is only part of what I've left behind. In the second safe, yes, there is a second one, behind the mirror in my bedroom, you'll find provisions I've made for David's debts and the family's future. But these provisions come with conditions that will require courage from all of you." Recovery is not just about money, Olivia. It's about acknowledging the truth, accepting responsibility, and choosing to build something better from the wreckage of what came before. Olivia read through the rest of the letter twice before its full implications sank in. Rose hadn't just anticipated this crisis. She'd orchestrated a solution that addressed not only the immediate financial danger, but the underlying pathologies that had created it. The letter concluded with detailed instructions for accessing the second safe and specific steps for implementing what Rose called the family recovery protocol. Racing to her grandmother's bedroom, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread, Olivia found herself standing before the antique mirror that had dominated one wall for as long as she could remember. The silvered glass reflected her own face, pale and determined, as she searched for the hidden mechanism Rose had described. The panel behind the mirror was so cleverly concealed that even knowing it existed, Olivia spent several minutes locating the pressure point that would release the catch. When it finally clicked open, she found herself looking at a much larger safe than the one in the office, its steel door bearing a digital lock instead of the traditional combination dial. Her grandmother's instructions were precise. The lock would respond to her fingerprint, programmed months ago during what Rose had claimed was simply an update to her security system. When Olivia pressed her thumb to the scanner, the mechanism hummed softly, and the heavy door swung open. Inside, she found a carefully organized collection of documents that revealed the full scope of Rose's preparations. Bank statements showed multiple accounts that had been quietly funding what Rose termed family emergency reserves for over a year. Legal papers outlined trust structures designed to provide support while ensuring accountability. Most shocking of all were detailed investigative reports on Marcus Torres and his organization, compiled by a private security firm that had been working for Rose for months. The second letter, sealed in a manila envelope marked "For implementation when crisis reaches critical stage," laid out Rose's complete strategy with the precision of a military campaign. My dear Olivia, by now you understand that I've been preparing for this confrontation for quite some time. The funds in these accounts are sufficient to cover David's debts in full, including all interest and penalties that Torres has accumulated. But simply paying the money would solve nothing. It would only enable David to continue his destructive patterns until the next crisis arose. Instead, I've structured this assistance as a comprehensive family intervention. The money will be released only when all parties agree to specific conditions that address the root causes of this disaster. The conditions Rose outlined were comprehensive and non-negotiable. David would enter a residential addiction treatment program for a minimum of 90 days, followed by ongoing counseling and participation in a recovery community. Richard would close his independent practice and work under supervision at a larger firm, with his conduct monitored by the State Bar Association. Both men would make full restitution to Olivia for their attempted fraud, working under financial supervision until their debts to the family were cleared. But Rose's plan went beyond punishment. She had also arranged for family counseling, financial education, and the gradual rebuilding of trust through structured interactions and shared accountability. The approach reflected her understanding that healing required not just consequences but also hope for redemption. I know you'll be angry at them, and rightfully so, Rose's letter continued. What they attempted was not just illegal, but a profound betrayal of the trust that should exist between family members. But remember that desperate people make terrible choices, and our family's strength has always come from protecting each other, even when protection looks like accountability rather than unconditional support. You have a choice to make, my dear granddaughter. You can pursue legal prosecution, which would likely result in prison sentences and the permanent destruction of our family. Or you can implement this intervention plan, which offers the possibility of healing and redemption for everyone involved. I cannot make this choice for you. It must come from your own heart and judgment. But I will say this. I've watched you grow into a young woman of extraordinary wisdom and compassion. Your psychological training has given you insights into human behavior that I believe will serve you well in this crisis. Trust your instincts, trust your education, and trust the love that still exists beneath all this pain and deception. When Olivia returned to the dining room with her arms full of documents, she found her family exactly as she'd left them. David slumped in his chair with his head in his hands, Linda crying quietly while staring at the shattered remains of her teacup, and Richard beginning to stir on the living room couch, his confusion evident as the sedative gradually wore off. "Grandmother knew," Olivia announced, her voice cutting through the heavy silence as she spread papers across the mahogany table. "She knew about all of it." David's head snapped up, hope and terror warring in his bloodshot eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean she planned for this. She set aside money to cover your debts, Dad. Enough to pay off Torres and give you a fresh start. Olivia paused, watching hope flicker and grow in his expression before continuing with deliberate gravity. But it comes with conditions you're not going to like. As she explained Rose's comprehensive intervention plan, Olivia watched her family grapple with a complex mixture of relief, shame, and dawning understanding. The money was there, enough to save them from Torres and the immediate consequences of their desperate actions. But Rose's conditions were as comprehensive as they were non-negotiable. Residential treatment, David repeated, his voice hollow with the weight of finally confronting the addiction he'd hidden for so long. She knew about the gambling. She knew everything. She documented everything, Olivia confirmed, showing him a folder thick with evidence. The progression of your debts, the increasingly dangerous creditors, the mounting pressure that drove you to this desperate scheme. She even has copies of communications with Torres that prove you were coerced into some of your most questionable decisions. Jenny had moved closer during the explanation, reading over Olivia's shoulder with an expression of growing amazement. Your grandmother was a strategic genius, she murmured. This isn't just a financial solution, it's a complete family rehabilitation program. Richard, now more alert but still groggy from the sedative, struggled to sit up on the couch. The legal implications of what we attempted are covered, Olivia said, showing him another thick folder. Grandmother worked with attorneys you don't know about. Independent counsel who specialize in family crisis intervention and who can handle the Torres situation legally and safely. She even has contracts prepared that will satisfy Torres's organization while protecting our family from future exploitation. Linda looked up through her tears, her face a mask of confusion and desperate hope. She forgave us? Even knowing what we were planning to do to you? She protected us, Olivia corrected gently. There's a difference between forgiveness and protection. Forgiveness is something we'll all have to work toward together. What she did was provide a path back from the edge of disaster, but it's a path that requires genuine commitment to change. The sound of a car turning into the driveway made them all freeze. Through the dining room window, Olivia could see a black sedan with tinted windows parking behind David's BMW. Marcus Torres had arrived for his 8 o'clock appointment, precisely on time and undoubtedly expecting either payment or collateral. What do we do? David whispered, panic creeping back into his voice despite the promise of Rose's solution. Olivia looked at the documents spread before them, evidence of crimes and evidence of redemption, the careful preparation of a woman who had loved her family enough to save them from themselves. Then she looked at her family's frightened faces, seeing not the conspirators who had tried to drug and defraud her, but broken people who had made terrible choices and now faced the possibility of something better. We tell him the truth, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. We show him grandmother's provisions, and we end this tonight. But first, I need to know, are you all committed to following through with Rose's conditions? The treatment, the restitution, the supervised rebuilding of your lives? Because if we do this, there's no going back. No more lies, no more deception, no more desperate schemes. David nodded immediately, his relief overwhelming what remained of his pride. Linda took his hand, her own nod firm despite the tears still streaming down her face. Richard, still fighting the sedative's lingering effects, managed a weak but determined yes. The doorbell rang, its sound echoing through the house like a judgment bell, calling them to account for everything that had brought them to this moment. Then let's go face Marcus Torres together, Olivia said, gathering the documents that would either save her family or destroy them completely. The final confrontation was about to begin. The man who stood on the Barrett family's front porch looked nothing like the monster Olivia had constructed in her imagination. Marcus Torres was of medium height and build, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that spoke of expensive tailoring and careful attention to detail. His dark hair was styled conservatively, and his face carried the kind of professional composure that might have belonged to a banker or financial advisor. Only his eyes betrayed something harder beneath the polished exterior, a calculating coldness that suggested he was accustomed to getting what he wanted, regardless of the methods required. "Mr. Barrett," Torres said as David opened the door, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested educated origins despite his current profession. "I trust you're prepared for our discussion this evening." David's hand trembled almost imperceptibly on the door handle, but his voice remained steady. "Of course. Please, come in. My family is eager to resolve our business." Torres stepped into the foyer with the confidence of a man who had entered many homes under similar circumstances. His gaze swept the space with practiced assessment, noting the valuable artwork, the quality of the furnishings, the general air of wealth that pervaded the Barrett estate. When his eyes settled on Olivia, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. "You must be Olivia," he said, extending a manicured hand. "I've heard so much about you. My condolences on your grandmother's passing." Rose Barrett was quite the remarkable woman. The casual mention of her grandmother's name sent a jolt through Olivia. "You knew my grandmother?" Torres's smile was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to seem genuine, controlled enough to maintain professional distance. "We never met personally, but her reputation in business circles was substantial. A woman who understood the value of strategic thinking and decisive action." The compliment felt like a subtle threat, and Olivia realized that Torres was far more sophisticated than the crude loan shark she'd expected. This was a man who operated in gray areas of legitimate business, using psychological pressure and professional intimidation, rather than overt violence to achieve his goals. "Shall we proceed to somewhere more comfortable?" Torres suggested, his tone making it clear that this was less a request than a direction. "I believe we have several matters to discuss." David led them to the living room, where Richard was now sitting upright on the couch, still pale from the sedative, but alert enough to participate in what was to come. Linda hovered near the doorway, her nervous energy more pronounced than ever in the presence of this stranger, who represented such danger to her family. Torres settled into Rose's favorite armchair with unconscious authority, his posture relaxed but his attention sharp. "I must say, this is a beautiful home. It would be unfortunate if circumstances forced any changes to your living situation." The veiled threat hung in the air like smoke, and Olivia felt her family's collective tension ratchet higher. But she also felt the weight of Rose's documents in her hands, and with it, a growing sense of empowerment. "Mr. Torres," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than she'd expected. "Before we discuss our family's debts, I think you should know that my grandmother left very specific instructions for handling this situation." Torres's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in his professional composure. "Instructions? My grandmother was apparently aware of my father's financial difficulties and your organization's involvement in them. She prepared a comprehensive solution." Olivia spread Rose's documents across the coffee table with deliberate ceremony, one that addresses not only the immediate debt, but also the legal and ethical implications of how that debt was acquired. For the first time since entering the house, Torres leaned forward, his casual confidence giving way to genuine interest. His eyes scanned the papers quickly, and Olivia watched his expression shift as he recognized official letterheads from major financial institutions and law firms. "This is unexpected," he admitted, his tone more cautious now. "Your grandmother was quite thorough." "She was also quite well connected," Olivia continued, pulling out a folder that bore the seal of a prominent investigation firm. "These reports detail the methods your organization uses to pressure clients into increasingly disadvantageous agreements, methods that might interest federal authorities investigating predatory lending practices." The change in Torres was subtle but unmistakable. The polished veneer remained, but something harder and more dangerous flickered behind his eyes. "Ms. Barrett, I hope you're not suggesting that our business relationship with your father was anything other than legitimate." "I'm suggesting," Olivia replied evenly, "that my grandmother documented a pattern of escalating pressure that pushed my father beyond rational decision-making and into increasingly desperate choices. Choices that included attempting to defraud me of my inheritance." David made a strangled sound from across the room, but Olivia pressed on. The power she felt in this moment was intoxicating. The ability to protect her family while simultaneously holding them accountable for their actions. "However," she continued, watching Torres carefully, My grandmother also provided a solution that benefits everyone involved. Full payment of my father's debts, including all interest and penalties, in exchange for the complete dissolution of any future claims against our family. Torres was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents with the attention of someone who understood that the game had suddenly changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. The amount in question is substantial, $2.3 million, including accumulated interest, which these accounts can cover, Olivia confirmed, showing him bank statements that made his eyes widen slightly. But the payment comes with conditions that extend beyond simple monetary exchange. What kind of conditions? Olivia looked around the room at her family, David pale and trembling with a mixture of fear and hope, Linda crying silently near the doorway, Richard struggling to focus through the lingering effects of the sedative, and Jenny standing alert and ready to support whatever came next. My father enters addiction treatment immediately, she said. My uncle submits to supervision by the State Bar Association. Both men make full restitution for their attempted fraud against me. And your organization signs a comprehensive agreement never to engage in business with any member of our family again. Torres considered this for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently on the arm of Rose's chair. You're asking me to walk away from what has been a very profitable relationship. I'm offering you full payment for a debt that might otherwise become uncollectible if my father's gambling addiction destroys what remains of his assets, Olivia countered. Plus the avoidance of federal scrutiny that these investigation reports might attract. The threat was delicately phrased but unmistakable. Torres's organization operated in legal gray areas that depended on staying beneath the attention of federal authorities. The kind of detailed documentation Rose had compiled could prove problematic if it reached the wrong hands. Your grandmother was quite the strategist, Torres said finally, and for the first time his smile seemed genuinely amused rather than professionally controlled. She understood leverage. She understood family, Olivia corrected. And she understood that sometimes protecting the people you love requires preparing for their worst possible choices. Torres stood and walked to the window, looking out at the estate grounds that represented so much of what David stood to lose. When he turned back, his expression had shifted into something more businesslike. The payment terms would need to be immediate, he said. Wire transfer, fully verified and completed tonight. That's possible, Olivia confirmed, though her heart was racing at the prospect of transferring such a massive sum. The accounts are already prepared for immediate transfer. And the legal protections you mentioned? Richard stirred on the couch, his professional instincts overriding the sedative's lingering effects. Independent counsel prepared comprehensive agreements that protect all parties while ensuring compliance with federal banking regulations, he said, his words slightly slurred but legally precise. Torres studied Richard with interest. You're the family attorney who helped create this situation. I'm the family attorney who's going to help resolve it, Richard replied, with more dignity than Olivia had expected, from someone who'd been drugged into confession an hour earlier. The negotiation that followed was unlike anything Olivia had anticipated. Torres proved to be not just sophisticated but surprisingly reasonable when faced with a solution that met his organization's financial goals while protecting their operational security. Rose's preparation had been so thorough that every potential objection was addressed, every legal concern anticipated. There is one additional matter, Torres said, as they neared agreement on the financial terms. Your father's gambling addiction. My organization has encountered this pattern before. Full payment of debts followed by renewed gambling that creates new problems within months. David flinched as if he'd been struck, but Torres continued with clinical precision. We've found that the most effective protection for all parties is verified entry into treatment programs with long-term monitoring. Not as punishment, but as practical risk management. That's already part of our family plan, Olivia said, surprised to find herself grateful for Torres's pragmatic approach to what she'd expected to be a more confrontational encounter. Excellent. Then we understand each other completely. The actual transfer of funds took nearly 2 hours, with multiple phone calls to banks, verification of account numbers, and coordination with the legal team Rose had assembled months earlier. Throughout the process, Olivia found herself observing Torres with fascination. He was undoubtedly dangerous, operating a business that destroyed families and exploited desperation. But he was also professional in ways that made the entire transaction feel almost routine. "Your grandmother," Torres said during one of the waiting periods while banks processed verification codes, "understood something that many people in your father's situation never grasp." "What's that?" "That debt is not just about money. It's about power, control, and the choices people make when they feel trapped." He paused, studying David with something that might have been sympathy. "She created a solution that addresses the underlying problem, not just the financial symptom." As the evening progressed and the transfer neared completion, Olivia watched her family's transformation from terrified potential victims to people beginning to process the reality of genuine second chances. David wept when the final confirmation came through, his relief so overwhelming that Linda had to support him physically. Richard, now fully recovered from the sedative, reviewed each document with the meticulous attention to detail that had once made him a successful attorney. "There is one more thing," Torres said as he prepared to leave. "A piece of advice that your grandmother would probably appreciate." "What's that?" "Recovery from addiction, whether it's gambling, substances, or any other compulsive behavior, requires more than just removing the immediate consequences. It requires rebuilding trust, establishing new patterns, and accepting that some relationships may never return to what they were before." His eyes moved around the room, taking in each family member. "You've all betrayed each other in fundamental ways tonight. The money solves the external pressure, but healing the internal damage will take much longer." Olivia felt the weight of his words settling over the room like a heavy blanket. The immediate crisis was resolved, but the emotional aftermath, the shattered trust, the guilt, the fear, would linger long after Torres disappeared from their lives. "However," he continued, "I've seen families recover from worse betrayals than this. The key is honesty, patience, and the recognition that love sometimes requires holding people accountable for their actions rather than simply forgiving them." As Torres gathered his papers and prepared to leave, he paused at the front door. "Ms. Barrett, your grandmother left you more than money. She left you the tools to become the kind of leader your family needs. Use them wisely." After he was gone, the Barrett family sat in their living room surrounded by the detritus of their near destruction, scattered legal documents, empty teacups, the lingering tension of a crisis barely averted. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had been revealed and everything that still needed to be addressed. "What happens now?" Linda asked finally, her voice small and uncertain. Olivia looked at the people who had raised her, loved her, and ultimately tried to betray her in their desperation. The anger was still there, burning beneath the surface, but it was tempered now by understanding and the recognition that healing would require time and effort from everyone involved. "Now we begin the real work," she said. "Dad, you check into treatment tomorrow. Uncle Richard, you meet with the Bar Association next week. And all of us start learning how to trust each other again." "And if we can't?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then we learn to build something new," Olivia replied, thinking of Rose's letters and the wisdom they contained. "Grandmother didn't save us so we could go back to the way things were. She saved us so we could become what we should have been all along." The night was far from over, and the conversation that followed would be one of the most difficult of Olivia's life. But for the first time since returning home, she felt genuinely hopeful about her family's future. Rose's final gift hadn't just been money or protection. It had been the possibility of redemption, bought with careful planning and paid for with the courage to demand accountability. As she looked around the room at her flawed, desperate, beloved family, Olivia realized that sometimes the greatest act of love was refusing to enable someone's self-destruction, even when that refusal felt like cruelty. Her grandmother had understood that wisdom, and now it was her responsibility to carry it forward. The tea ceremony that had started this crisis seemed like something from another lifetime, but Olivia found herself thinking that perhaps they would have tea together again someday, real tea, shared in genuine connection rather than deception. But that day was still far in the future, and there was much healing to be done before they could earn their way back to that simple intimacy. For now, it was enough that they were all still here, still breathing, still capable of change. Rose's plan had worked, but its ultimate success would depend on choices yet to be made and trust yet to be rebuilt. The hardest part was just beginning. The silence that followed Marcus Torres's departure was unlike any quiet Olivia had ever experienced in her childhood home. It was not the comfortable silence of a family at peace, nor the tense quiet that preceded an argument. This was the hollow, echoing silence of people who had been stripped of all pretense and now had to figure out how to exist in the raw truth of what they had revealed to each other. The living room looked like the aftermath of a natural disaster. Legal documents lay scattered across every surface, some bearing signatures that represented salvation, others marked with the evidence of attempted betrayal. The ornate tea service remained on the side table where Linda had abandoned it hours earlier, a monument to the deception that had brought them to this moment. Even the furniture seemed different now. Rose's chair would forever bear the memory of Marcus Torres's presence, while the couch where Richard had recovered from his sedative-induced confession felt tainted by the family secrets it had witnessed. Olivia stood by the window, watching the tail lights of Torres's sedan disappear down the driveway, and felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a mantle she'd never asked to wear. At 28, she had become the de facto head of a family that had nearly destroyed itself, the keeper of secrets that could still ruin lives, and the guardian of a recovery process that might take years to complete. "Olivia," David said finally, his voice so broken that she barely recognized it as belonging to her father. "I know there's nothing I can say that will make this right, nothing that can excuse what we tried to do to you." She turned from the window to face him, seeing not the confident real estate developer who had been her hero throughout childhood, but a man hollowed out by addiction and desperation. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and his hands shook with a tremor that spoke of deeper problems than just the night's stress. "You're right," she said quietly. "There's nothing you can say that will make it right. But that doesn't mean we can't figure out how to move forward." Linda looked up from her place on the sofa, her face streaked with tears and mascara. "How can you even look at us? How can you bear to be in the same room with people who would have—" She couldn't finish the sentence, the reality of what they had attempted too horrific to speak aloud. "Because you're still my family," Olivia replied, though the words felt strange in her mouth. "Because Grandmother Rose believed that even people who make terrible choices can find their way back to something better. And because the alternative, walking away and never speaking to any of you again, doesn't actually solve anything." Richard stirred on the couch, his lawyer's mind apparently working through the implications of everything that had transpired. "The legal ramifications of what we attempted," he said slowly. "Even with Rose's protection, even with Torres satisfied, we're still vulnerable to prosecution if you choose to pursue it. Is that what you're worried about?" Ginny asked, speaking for the first time since Torres had left. She'd been standing quietly near the doorway, observing the family dynamics, with the detached interest of someone who understood she was both part of the crisis and separate from it. "Whether Olivia is going to send you to prison." "It's a legitimate concern," Richard replied defensively. "Conspiracy to commit fraud, drugging someone without consent, attempted theft, these are serious felonies. So is enabling your brother's gambling addiction and participating in schemes to defraud your own niece," Ginny shot back. "Maybe instead of worrying about prosecution, you should be worrying about how to earn back even a fraction of the trust you destroyed tonight." The exchange sparked something in Olivia. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of clarity that cut through the emotional fog of the evening. "Stop," she said, her voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone, including herself. "This isn't about punishment or legal consequences or even trust right now. This is about whether we're going to use the second chance Grandmother Rose gave us, or whether we're going to waste it on blame and self-pity." She moved to the center of the room, positioning herself where she could see everyone clearly. "We need to establish some ground rules for how we move forward, because what happened tonight changed everything about our family dynamic, and we can't pretend otherwise." David nodded eagerly, clearly desperate for any structure that might lead them away from the precipice they'd been standing on. "Whatever you think is best, sweetheart. Whatever you need from us." "First," Olivia said, pulling out a notebook and pen, a habit from her graduate studies that helped her organize her thoughts during crisis situations. We need to acknowledge the full scope of what happened here, not just tonight but everything that led to this moment. She looked at her father directly. Dad, you have a gambling addiction that has been destroying your life and your family's security for how long? David's face crumpled as if the direct question had physically struck him. 3 years, he whispered. Maybe 4. It started small, just a few bets to try to recoup some business losses. But then it became... I couldn't stop. Even when I was winning, I couldn't stop. And the debts? How long have you been borrowing from people like Torres? 18 months. The legitimate banks wouldn't extend more credit, and I thought I could turn it around. I thought if I could just get one big win. He trailed off, the hopelessness of his situation finally hitting him fully. Linda was crying again, but silently now, tears streaming down her face as she listened to her husband confess to years of deception. I knew something was wrong, she said. I knew he was hiding something, but I told myself it was just business stress. I didn't want to see how bad it really was. And when you did finally understand the scope of the problem, Olivia continued, your solution was to drug me and steal my inheritance. It wasn't supposed to hurt you, Linda said desperately. Richard said the documents would just transfer management of the money, not take it away from you completely. He said you'd still benefit from it, just with David making the decisions about investments and disbursements. Richard's laugh was bitter and self-recriminating. I told myself a lot of things to make the plan seem less horrible than it was. But the truth is, we were stealing from you. And we were doing it in the most violating way possible. There's no euphemism that makes that acceptable. Olivia made notes as each family member spoke, not because she needed to remember their confessions, but because the act of writing helped her process the magnitude of what they were dealing with. As a psychology student, she understood that addiction was a disease, but as the intended victim of their conspiracy, she struggled with the rage that kept threatening to overwhelm her analytical perspective. Uncle Richard, she said, what was your motivation? Dad's gambling explains his desperation, but what drove you to participate in this? Richard was quiet for so long that Olivia wondered if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow with shame. My practice has been failing for 2 years. I made some bad investments, took on some clients who couldn't pay their bills, and gradually I found myself in serious financial trouble. When David approached me about his situation, I saw an opportunity to solve both our problems. But it was more than that, Jenny said quietly. Wasn't it, Dad? Richard's eyes flicked to his daughter, and Olivia saw pain there that went deeper than financial desperation. I've resented Rose's favoritism toward you and your father's side of the family for most of my adult life, he admitted. She never thought I was good enough, never trusted me with important family decisions. When she died and left the bulk of her estate to you instead of dividing it equally among her children, it felt like one final insult. The confession hung in the air like smoke, and Olivia realized that the family dysfunction ran much deeper than David's addiction or their current financial crisis. Rose's favoritism had created wounds that had festered for decades, contributing to the desperation that had made tonight's betrayal possible. So this was partly revenge, she said, not accusingly but with clinical interest. It was a lot of things, Richard replied. Desperation, resentment, and the kind of moral flexibility that develops when you're drowning and someone throws you what looks like a lifeline. Olivia made more notes, beginning to see the psychological patterns that had created this crisis. Her graduate training in family systems theory provided a framework for understanding how multiple dysfunctions could compound and amplify each other until they created situations that seemed impossible to resolve. Jenny, she said, turning to her cousin, why did you decide to help me instead of protecting your father? Jenny moved closer, settling into a chair near where Olivia stood. Because I've watched my father make increasingly bad decisions my entire life, and I finally realized that protecting him from consequences was actually enabling him to get worse. She looked at Richard with a mixture of love and exasperation. Dad, you've been sliding ethically for years. Small compromises, cutting corners, bending rules for clients who paid well. I kept telling myself it was just the pressure of running a practice, but tonight made me realize you'd crossed a line you might never be able to come back from. So you chose Olivia over me, Richard said. his voice carrying a hurt that made him sound younger than his 55 years. "I chose honesty over enabling," Jenny corrected. "I chose accountability over family loyalty. And I chose to believe that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to help them destroy themselves." The conversation continued for hours, each family member taking turns to confess, explain, and gradually accept responsibility for their choices. Olivia found herself serving as both participant and facilitator, using her psychological training to guide the discussion while processing her own complex emotions about everything that had been revealed. As the night progressed, certain patterns became clear. David's addiction had created a crisis, but the family's response to that crisis had been shaped by years of poor communication, unresolved resentments, and a pattern of avoiding difficult conversations until they became emergencies. Rose's favoritism had created sibling rivalry that had never been addressed. Linda's dependence on David had prevented her from confronting his problems earlier, and Richard's professional struggles had made him vulnerable to ethical compromises that ultimately led to criminal behavior. "We need a plan," Olivia said finally, when the confessions had run their course and everyone sat in exhausted honesty. "Not just for implementing grandmother's conditions, but for rebuilding our family relationships in a way that's healthier than what we had before." She pulled out Rose's letters and reread portions of them aloud, particularly the sections that dealt with the long-term recovery process. Her grandmother's wisdom became even more apparent as Olivia shared the specific steps Rose had outlined for family healing. "First, Dad, you check into residential treatment tomorrow. The facility grandmother identified specializes in gambling addiction and has a 90-day program that includes family counseling components." David nodded, his acceptance complete. "I'm ready. I should have done it years ago." "Second, Uncle Richard, you meet with the State Bar Association representative that grandmother's attorneys have arranged. You'll be working under supervision for at least 2 years while your practice is restructured and your ethical fitness is evaluated." Richard's acceptance was more reluctant, but he nodded as well. "I understand. It's better than losing my license entirely." "Third, Mom, you're going to start individual counseling to address the codependency issues that made it possible for you to participate in this conspiracy. Grandmother's plan includes resources for that as well." Linda looked surprised. "I didn't realize that was part of it." "Grandmother was thorough," Olivia replied. "She understood that addiction affects entire families, not just the person with the primary problem. And Jenny and me, we're all participating in family therapy once Dad completes his initial treatment. But Jenny and I also need individual counseling to process the trauma of being betrayed by people we trusted." Jenny nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. Even though I chose to help you, this whole experience has been pretty devastating. I'm going to need help figuring out how to maintain a relationship with my father while not enabling his poor choices." The practical planning took another hour, with phone calls to treatment facilities, arrangements for David's immediate departure to residential care, and coordination with the various professionals Rose had assembled to support the family's recovery. Throughout the process, Olivia found herself amazed by her grandmother's foresight and preparation. "There's one more thing we need to address," she said as the night grew late and exhaustion began to overtake everyone. "The restitution grandmother required." She pulled out a folder that detailed the financial arrangements Rose had made for the family's accountability to Olivia. "Dad, Uncle Richard, you're both required to make monthly payments to me for the next 5 years as restitution for the attempted fraud. The amounts are calculated based on your projected earnings during recovery." "That seems fair," David said immediately. "More than fair, considering what we tried to do. The money will go into a trust that will fund family therapy, addiction recovery support, and eventually college funds for any future grandchildren grandmother might have had." Olivia paused, feeling the weight of Rose's planning. She wanted our recovery to benefit the entire family, including generations that haven't been born yet. Richard managed a weak smile. She really was thinking 3 steps ahead, wasn't she? "She was thinking about redemption," Olivia corrected. "About the possibility that even people who make terrible choices can find their way back to something better." As dawn approached and the family finally began to separate for a few hours of rest before David's departure to treatment, Olivia found herself alone with the documents that had saved them all. She spread Rose's letters across the coffee table and read through them one more time, looking for wisdom that might help her navigate the difficult months ahead. One passage stood out, written in Rose's careful handwriting with ink that had faded slightly with time. Recovery is not about returning to what was, but about building something new from the wreckage of what failed. Your family has the capacity for great love, but that love has been poisoned by secrets, addiction, and unaddressed resentments. The crisis you're facing is terrible, but it's also an opportunity to heal wounds that have been festering for decades. Be patient with them, Olivia, but don't mistake patience for enabling. Hold them accountable while offering them hope. Demand honesty while providing safety for that honesty to emerge. And remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to pretend that everything is fine when it clearly isn't. You have the strength and wisdom to lead this family through its healing. But don't try to carry the burden alone. Use the resources I've provided, trust the professionals I've identified, and lean on Jenny when you need support from someone who understands the complexity of loving people who have hurt you. Most importantly, remember that forgiveness is not the same thing as trust. Forgiveness can be given freely, but trust must be earned through consistent actions over time. You can forgive your family for what they tried to do to you, but requiring them to earn back your trust is not cruel. It's necessary for genuine healing. As the sun began to rise over the Barrett estate, casting golden light through the windows of the room where so much truth had been revealed, Olivia felt something she hadn't experienced since her grandmother's death: hope. Not the naive hope of someone who believed everything would magically return to normal, but the mature hope of someone who understood that healing was possible even from the deepest wounds. The road ahead would be long and difficult. There would be setbacks, relapses, moments of doubt and anger and grief for the family they'd lost in the process of becoming honest with each other. But Rose's plan provided a roadmap, and more importantly, it provided the resources, financial, legal, and emotional, that would make recovery possible. David would enter treatment in a few hours, beginning a journey that would either save his life or destroy what remained of their family if he couldn't commit to it fully. Richard would face professional consequences that might end his legal career, but could also provide an opportunity for ethical rehabilitation. Linda would confront codependency patterns that had enabled years of dysfunction. And Olivia would learn to be the kind of leader her family needed, someone who could balance accountability with compassion, someone who could hold space for healing while refusing to enable further destruction. The tea service still sat on the side table, a reminder of how close they'd come to disaster. But as Olivia looked at it now, she found herself thinking that perhaps someday they would share tea again, real tea, offered in genuine love rather than deception. But that day was still far in the future, and there was much work to be done before they could earn their way back to that simple intimacy. For now, it was enough that they were all still here, still breathing, still capable of change. The hardest part was just beginning, but at least now they would face it honestly, together, and with the wisdom of a grandmother who had loved them enough to save them from themselves. 6 months later, the morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of the Barrett estate, casting familiar patterns of light and shadow across the hardwood floors. Olivia stood at the counter, carefully measuring loose-leaf tea into a ceramic pot. Not the ornate service that had been used for deception, but a simple, honest vessel that spoke of genuine intention rather than manipulation. The ritual had taken months to reclaim, and even now, the act of preparing tea carried emotional weight that sometimes surprised her with its intensity. The kitchen itself bore witness to the changes that had transformed the Barrett family over the past 6 months. Where once Linda had moved through the space with nervous energy and hidden agenda, now she worked with a calm purpose that came from months of individual therapy and the gradual rebuilding of her sense of self-worth. The refrigerator door displayed a new collection of papers, not legal documents or threatening letters, but schedules for family therapy appointments, David's progress reports from treatment, and photographs from Jenny's graduation from a paralegal certification program. "The chamomile smells wonderful," Linda said, entering the kitchen with an armload of fresh flowers from Rose's garden. Her voice carried a peace that had been absent for years, not just since the crisis but from long before, when the stress of David's hidden addiction had created a constant undercurrent of anxiety in their home. David always loved chamomile tea in the morning, The mention of David no longer carried the weight of crisis and fear that had characterized family conversations for so long. He had completed his 90-day residential treatment program and was now living in a structured sober living facility, attending daily Gamblers Anonymous meetings, and working with a counselor who specialized in addiction recovery. His progress had been remarkable, though not without setbacks. There had been 2 significant relapses in the early months, moments that had tested everyone's commitment to the recovery process. "How did he sound when you talked to him yesterday?" Olivia asked, arranging delicate porcelain cups on a simple wooden tray. These cups were new, purchased specifically for the genuine tea ceremonies they had begun holding monthly as a family. The symbolism had been important to everyone. They needed vessels that carried no history of deception, no memory of violated trust. "Hopeful," Linda replied, her smile carrying both joy and the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had learned not to mistake temporary progress for permanent recovery. "He's been sober for 43 days now, and his counselor thinks he's ready to start the transition program. If all goes well, he could be home for supervised visits within the month." The transition program was another element of Rose's comprehensive planning that had only become apparent as David's recovery progressed. Rather than simply releasing him back to the family environment where his addiction had flourished, the plan included a gradual reintegration process with ongoing oversight and support systems. David would live at home during the day but return to the sober living facility each evening for several months, gradually earning more freedom as he demonstrated consistent sobriety and engagement with his recovery program. "That's wonderful news," Olivia said, and found that she genuinely meant it. The anger that had burned so fiercely in the immediate aftermath of the conspiracy had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something more complex. A protective vigilance that coexisted with cautious hope, and increasingly compassion for the man who had been her father long before he became her would-be betrayer. The sound of a car in the driveway announced the arrival of their guests for this month's family tea ceremony. Through the window, Olivia could see Richard's modest sedan parking next to her own car. His BMW had been sold months ago as part of the restitution process, replaced with reliable but unremarkable transportation that better reflected his current financial reality. Richard's transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic of any family member's journey. The arrogant attorney who had orchestrated legal documents for fraud had been replaced by a man who approached each day with humility and a deep awareness of how close he had come to destroying not just his own life, but the lives of people he loved. His law license remained under review by the State Bar Association, but he had been allowed to work under supervision at a legal aid clinic, providing services to low-income clients who needed representation in housing disputes and family law matters. "The irony is not lost on me," he had told Olivia during one of their supervised meetings with the family therapist, "that I'm now helping people who are facing the kind of desperate situations that led me to make such terrible choices. Every client reminds me of how easily good people can find themselves trapped by circumstances they never anticipated." Jenny emerged from Richard's car carrying a manila folder and wearing the professional attire that had become her signature since starting her new position at a victims' rights organization. Her journey through the crisis had been different from the others. She had been an ally rather than a perpetrator, but she had still needed significant support to process the trauma of watching her father nearly destroy himself and learning to maintain healthy boundaries with someone she loved but could not enable. "How's the new caseload?" Olivia asked as Jenny entered the kitchen, accepting a warm hug that had become natural between the cousins over their months of shared healing. "Challenging," Jenny replied, setting her folder on the counter. "We're working with a family where the teenage daughter discovered her parents were stealing from her college fund to pay for the father's gambling debts. The parallels to our situation are uncomfortable, but also helpful. I understand what she's going through in ways that make me more effective at helping her navigate the legal and emotional complexities." It was one of the unexpected gifts of their family's crisis, the way their experiences had translated into deeper empathy and more effective service to others facing similar challenges. Jenny's work with victim advocacy had given her a sense of purpose that went beyond personal healing, while Richard's supervised legal practice had reconnected him with the ethical foundations of his profession that he had lost sight of during his years of moral compromise. Dr. Sarah Martinez arrived just as they were finishing preparations for the tea ceremony. her presence a reminder of how crucial outside support had been to their family's recovery. She had transitioned from family pharmacist to informal mentor and friend, someone who provided both professional guidance and personal encouragement during the most difficult phases of their healing. "How is everyone feeling about today?" Sarah asked as she settled into the living room where their tea ceremonies now took place. The formal dining room had been retired from family gatherings by mutual agreement. Too many painful memories made it impossible to use that space for the genuine connection they were trying to rebuild. "Nervous," Linda admitted, arranging the flowers she had picked in a simple vase on the coffee table. "David's counselor will be joining us virtually for part of the meeting, and she wants to discuss the timeline for his return home. It feels like such a huge step." "It is a huge step," Olivia agreed, settling into the chair that had gradually become recognized as hers. Not Rose's old chair, which remained empty as a reminder of the wisdom that still guided their family, but a new piece that represented her growing role as the family's emotional center. "But it's also a step we've been preparing for through months of work. We're not the same people who nearly destroyed each other 6 months ago." The virtual component of their tea ceremony was another innovation that had emerged from their recovery process. David's counselor, Dr. Patricia Hendricks, regularly joined their family meetings via video call, providing professional guidance while allowing David to participate in family discussions, even while living in residential care. Today's session would be particularly significant because it would determine the timeline for David's transition back to supervised home visits. As they settled into their chairs with steaming cups of chamomile tea, Olivia found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The last 6 months had been the most difficult period of her life, but also the most transformative. She had completed her graduate program while managing her family's crisis, writing her thesis on family systems recovery in cases of financial trauma and addiction. The academic work had provided a framework for understanding their experiences, while also processing her own emotional journey through research and analysis. "Before we connect with Dr. Hendricks," Olivia said, pulling out the notebook that had become a constant companion during their family meetings, "I'd like us to check in with each other about how we're feeling individually and as a family." This ritual had been suggested by their family therapist, Dr. Maria Santos, who had worked with them weekly throughout their recovery process. The check-ins served multiple purposes. They provided a structured way to share emotions and concerns. They reinforced the commitment to honesty that had become central to their new family dynamic, and they created space for addressing small issues before they could grow into larger problems. "I'll start," Linda said, her voice carrying the strength that had developed as she had worked through her own codependency issues and begun rebuilding her sense of individual identity. "I'm feeling hopeful about David's progress, but also anxious about the transition. I've been working hard in therapy to avoid falling back into patterns of enabling or trying to control his recovery process. But having him home again will test those new skills in ways I haven't experienced yet." She paused, looking around the circle at faces that had become both more familiar and more complex through months of intensive family work. "I'm also grateful. Grateful that we're all still here, still trying, still committed to doing this differently than we did before. 6 months ago, I thought we had lost everything. Now I can see that what we lost was a family dynamic that was built on secrets and denial, and what we're building in its place is much healthier, even if it's harder." Richard nodded thoughtfully before responding. "I'm struggling with patience," he admitted, "both with my own progress and with the pace of rebuilding trust within our family. Working at the legal aid clinic has been humbling but also rewarding. I'm remembering why I became a lawyer in the first place, which was to help people navigate systems that can be overwhelming and intimidating. But the supervised practice conditions feel restrictive, and there are moments when I resent the oversight, even though I know it's necessary." He reached for his teacup, a gesture that had become unconscious during their months of regular ceremonies. "I'm also dealing with shame in ways that surprise me. I thought I had processed the guilt about what I tried to do to Olivia, but it resurfaces at unexpected moments. Last week a client thanked me for helping her avoid foreclosure, and instead of feeling good about the work, I found myself thinking about how I had tried to steal from my own niece. The cognitive dissonance between the person I'm trying to be now and the person I was 6 months ago is difficult." Jenny leaned forward slightly, her expression showing the careful attention that had become her hallmark during family discussions. "I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness lately," she said. not just forgiving Dad for what he did, but forgiving myself for all the ways I enabled his poor choices over the years by not speaking up when I knew something was wrong. She gestured toward the folder she had brought, which contained materials from her work with other families in crisis. In my job, I see people struggling with the same kinds of decisions I faced. How much to protect someone you love from consequences, when loyalty becomes enabling. How to maintain relationships with people who have hurt you. It's made me realize that our crisis wasn't just about addiction and financial desperation. It was about a family system that had never learned how to have difficult conversations until those conversations became life-or-death emergency interventions. "My turn," Olivia said, setting down her teacup and consulting the notes she had made in preparation for this meeting. "I'm feeling proud of how far we've all come, but also aware of how much work we still have ahead of us. Finishing my graduate program while managing everything that's happened has been exhausting, but it's also given me tools for understanding our recovery process that I think will serve our family well in the long term." She looked at each family member in turn, seeing not just the people who had betrayed her trust 6 months ago, but individuals who had committed to the difficult work of genuine change. "I'm also feeling ready for Dad to come home, but with conditions and boundaries that I think will be important for everyone's continued recovery. Dr. Hendricks and I have discussed this extensively, and we've developed a plan for his reintegration that protects both his sobriety and our family's emotional safety." The laptop on the coffee table chimed softly, indicating an incoming video call from Dr. Hendricks. As they connected to David's treatment facility, Olivia felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that accompanied these virtual family meetings. David's image appeared on the screen, and she was struck once again by how different he looked from the desperate, hollow-eyed man who had tried to drug her 6 months earlier. Recovery had returned color to his complexion and clarity to his eyes. He had gained back some of the weight that stress and addiction had stripped away, and his posture carried a confidence that was different from the false bravado that had characterized his pre-recovery personality. This new confidence seemed grounded in genuine self-awareness, rather than the need to project success while hiding failure. "Good morning, everyone," David said, his voice warm but carrying the careful tone of someone who understood that every conversation was still part of an ongoing process of rebuilding trust. "Dr. Hendricks is here with me, and we're both excited to discuss the transition timeline with you." Dr. Hendricks appeared on camera beside David, a woman in her 50s, whose combination of professional expertise and genuine warmth had made her an invaluable guide through the complexities of addiction recovery within a family system. She had worked with the Barrett family throughout David's treatment, helping them understand the nuances of supporting someone in recovery without enabling relapse. "Before we discuss the timeline," Dr. Hendricks said, "I'd like to hear from each of you about your feelings regarding David's potential return to home visits. This is a significant step in his recovery process, but it's also a major transition for the entire family system." Linda spoke first, her voice steady despite the emotion underlying her words. "I want David home more than anything, but I also want to make sure we're all prepared for the challenges that will come with that transition. I've been working hard to develop new communication patterns and to avoid falling back into codependent behaviors, but I know that having him home will test those new skills in ways I haven't experienced yet." Richard nodded in agreement. "I'm supportive of David's return, but I also think we need to be realistic about the ongoing nature of recovery. From my own experience with supervised practice and the oversight from the Bar Association, I know that accountability structures are crucial for maintaining progress. I assume there will be similar structures in place for David's home visits." "Absolutely," Dr. Hendricks confirmed. "The transition plan includes daily check-ins with his sponsor, continued participation in Gamblers Anonymous meetings, ongoing individual counseling, and participation in family therapy sessions. David will also be subject to random financial audits and will not have independent access to family bank accounts during the initial transition period." Jenny raised her hand slightly, a gesture that had become her way of indicating she wanted to contribute to the discussion. "I think it's important that we acknowledge how much the family dynamic has changed during David's absence. We've all been working on our individual recovery and on rebuilding our relationships with each other, but David's return will necessarily alter those dynamics. I want to make sure we have plans in place for addressing the adjustments that everyone will need to make." Olivia appreciated her cousin's insight, which reflected the system's thinking that had become central to their recovery process. "I agree with Jenny," she said. "And I want to add that while I'm ready for Dad to come home, I also need everyone to understand that my willingness to rebuild our relationship is contingent on his continued commitment to recovery and accountability. The trust that was broken 6 months ago is still in the process of being rebuilt, and that process can't be rushed or forced." David's response was immediate and heartfelt. "I understand completely, and I want you to know that I don't expect anything to go back to the way it was before. I don't want it to go back to the way it was before, because the way it was before nearly destroyed our family. I'm committed to earning back your trust through consistent actions over time, not through words or promises." He paused, gathering his thoughts in the careful way that had become characteristic of his communication style during recovery. "Dr. Hendricks and I have spent a lot of time discussing what accountability looks like in practical terms, and I'm prepared for the level of oversight and structure that will be necessary. I understand that my addiction hurt all of you, and that my recovery has to include making amends not just through words, but through sustained behavioral change." Dr. Hendricks leaned forward slightly, her professional demeanor conveying both authority and compassion. "I want to emphasize that David's progress has been exceptional, but recovery from gambling addiction is a lifelong process that requires ongoing vigilance and support. The transition plan we've developed is designed to provide maximum support for his continued sobriety, while also protecting the family relationships that are still healing." She pulled out a folder containing detailed documentation of David's treatment progress and the proposed transition timeline. "I'm recommending that we begin with supervised day visits starting next week, progressing to overnight visits after 30 days of successful day visits, and eventually to full-time residence with ongoing support structures after 90 days of successful overnight visits." The timeline felt both exciting and daunting to Olivia. After months of family therapy and individual healing work, she was ready to attempt rebuilding a relationship with her father, but she also understood the risks involved. Gambling addiction had high relapse rates, and the stress of family reintegration could potentially trigger setbacks that might undo months of progress. "What does supervision look like for the day visits?" Linda asked, her question reflecting the practical concerns that had become central to their family's approach to recovery planning. "David will be accompanied by a recovery coach during his first several visits," Dr. Hendricks explained. "The coach will observe family interactions, provide real-time support if challenging situations arise, and help David practice the coping strategies he's developed during treatment. The goal is to ensure that he has professional support available while he readjusts to family dynamics and begins implementing his recovery tools in the home environment." Richard, drawing on his legal background, asked about the financial oversight components of the transition plan. "What mechanisms will be in place to ensure that David doesn't have access to funds that could enable gambling behavior?" "Comprehensive financial monitoring," Dr. Hendricks replied. "David will have access to a supervised spending account for personal expenses, but all major financial decisions will require approval from the family's financial advisor. Additionally, his phone and computer access will be monitored for the first 90 days to prevent access to online gambling sites or communication with individuals associated with his previous gambling activities." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from daily schedules to emergency protocols to long-term recovery planning. Throughout the discussion, Olivia was struck by the thoroughness of Rose's planning, which had anticipated even these detailed implementation questions and provided resources for addressing them. As the video call concluded and they said goodbye to David and Dr. Hendricks, the family sat quietly for several minutes, processing the significance of what they had just discussed. The transition plan represented hope for genuine healing, but also acknowledgement that their recovery journey was far from complete. "I have something I want to share with everyone," Olivia said, reaching for a letter she had brought specifically for this meeting. "I've been accepted to a doctoral program in family psychology, with a specialization in addiction recovery and family systems therapy." The announcement sparked immediate congratulations from everyone present, but Olivia raised her hand to indicate she wasn't finished. "The program includes a research component, where I'll be studying family recovery processes following financial trauma and betrayal. With everyone's permission, I'd like to document our own recovery journey as part of that research." "You want to study us?" Jenny asked, her tone curious rather than concerned. "I want to study what we've learned," Olivia clarified. "The interventions that Rose developed for our family were incredibly sophisticated, but they were also specific to our particular situation. I think there's value in understanding which elements of our recovery process might be applicable to other families facing similar crises." Linda's eyes brightened with interest. "So our experience could help other families?" "That's the hope," Olivia confirmed. "Obviously, any research would maintain confidentiality and would only proceed with everyone's informed consent. But I think we've learned things about family recovery that could be valuable to other people who find themselves in situations similar to ours." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's a wonderful way to honor Rose's legacy and to find meaning in what we've been through. Count me in." The agreement was unanimous, and as they began discussing the practical implications of participating in doctoral research, Olivia felt a sense of purpose that had been developing throughout their recovery process. The crisis that had nearly destroyed their family was becoming the foundation for work that might help other families avoid similar devastation or recover more effectively if prevention wasn't possible. As the afternoon progressed, they moved through their established tea ceremony rituals, sharing updates on individual progress, discussing challenges and concerns, celebrating small victories, and planning for the week ahead. The ceremony concluded, as it always did, with a moment of silent reflection in memory of Rose Barrett and in gratitude for the wisdom she had provided. "I have one more thing to share," Linda said as they prepared to clean up. She pulled a small wooden box from her purse, recognizing it as the one that had contained Rose's letters. "I found this while organizing some of Rose's personal items, and I think it belongs to Olivia." Inside the box was a single letter, sealed in an envelope that bore Olivia's name and a date 6 months in the future from Rose's death. The timing suggested that Rose had intended for this letter to be found during the family's recovery process, once the immediate crisis had been resolved, and the healing work was well underway. With trembling hands, Olivia opened the envelope and began reading aloud. "My dearest granddaughter, if you are reading this letter, then my planning has succeeded beyond my greatest hopes. Your family has survived its darkest crisis and has begun the long journey toward genuine healing. I am so proud of the strength and wisdom you have shown during this impossible time. By now you understand that the crisis you faced was not really about money or addiction, or even betrayal, though all of those elements were present. It was about a family that had lost its way, that had allowed secrets and shame to poison the love that should have been your greatest strength. What you have built in place of that broken system is something new and infinitely more valuable. You have learned to love each other honestly, to hold each other accountable while still offering support, and to face difficult truths without letting them destroy your connections to each other. The doctoral program you have been accepted to, yes, I knew about that too, and I may have had some influence on the admission committee, will allow you to share what you have learned with other families who are struggling as you have struggled. This is my final gift to you, the opportunity to transform your pain into purpose, your crisis into service to others. Remember that recovery is not a destination but a daily choice. There will be setbacks, moments of doubt, times when the old patterns seem easier than the new ones you are building. During those times, return to the tea ceremony. Return to honest conversation. Return to the love that has sustained your family through its worst moments and will continue to sustain you through whatever challenges lie ahead. I love you beyond measure, and I am so grateful that you will carry our family's story forward with wisdom, compassion, and the strength to demand both accountability and grace. All my love, Grandmother Rose. P.S. In the garden, beneath the largest rose bush, you will find one more gift. Plant it where you can see it from the kitchen window, and let it remind you that even the most broken things can grow into something beautiful." The letter left them all in tears, but they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. Rose's presence in their recovery had been constant, but this final letter felt like a benediction, a blessing on the work they had done, and permission to continue growing into the family they were meant to be. As the sun began to set, they walked together to Rose's garden and found the place she had described. Buried beneath the largest rose bush was a small sapling. Another rose, but a variety none of them recognized. The tag attached to the stem identified it as a hybrid rose had developed herself, a combination of traditional roses with modern disease resistance and continuous blooming capabilities. She created her own variety, Jenny marveled as they carefully transplanted the sapling to a spot visible from the kitchen window. Even her plants were part of the planning. "What should we call it?" Linda asked, gently watering the newly planted rose. "The recovery rose," Olivia said without hesitation. "A reminder that even after the worst damage, new growth is possible." As they stood together in the gathering twilight, dirty from their gardening but connected in ways that would have been impossible 6 months earlier, Olivia felt the deep satisfaction of work that was far from complete but was progressing with hope and purpose. David would come home soon, and there would be new challenges to navigate, new growth to achieve, new trust to build. But they would face those challenges together, armed with the tools Rose had provided and the strength they had developed through surviving their worst crisis. The tea ceremonies would continue, honest conversations would remain their foundation, and the recovery rose would bloom as a symbol of their commitment to choosing healing over hiding, growth over comfort, and love that demanded the best from each other rather than love that enabled the worst. The Barrett family was being reborn, one honest conversation at a time, one accountable choice at a time, one ceremony of genuine connection at a time. It was slow work, sometimes painful work, but it was the work of building something that could last, something that honored both the love they had always shared and the wisdom they had gained through nearly losing each other completely. 6 months earlier, Olivia had returned home for a grandmother's funeral and discovered a family conspiracy that nearly destroyed everything she held dear. Now, she was preparing to welcome her father home to a family that had learned to love each other with both grace and accountability, that had chosen truth over comfort, and that had found its way back to the genuine connection that had always been possible but had never been practiced. The tea was honest now, the conversations were real, and the love they shared was strong enough to hold both the weight of their failures and the promise of their continued growth. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything Rose had hoped for when she planned their salvation and trusted them to choose healing over destruction. The recovery rose would bloom soon, and when it did, it would join the tea ceremonies as a symbol of the family they had become. Beautiful, resilient, and rooted in soil that had been enriched by everything they had survived together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. ...